Benevolent General Khandare, Mr. Sinha, Mr. Subin Sinha, Mr. Abhijit Sinha, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm truly delighted to be here. I was asked to speak on funding this green transition and speak on blended finance, which will be because climate finance will be the biggest challenge of our times. So this climate transition, to my mind, is the biggest transformation, structural transformation that will take place. Because when the western part of the world was growing and expanding at rapid pace, they did urbanization, which was based on making cities for cars and not for people. So if you look at United States of America, there are 1,150 cars per 1,000 people. In Europe, there are close to 900 cars per 1,000 people. In India, there are only about 28 cars per 1,000 people in India. So when America was urbanizing, their car companies, Ford and General Motors, they bought over the railway companies and actually destroyed them so that cars could sell. And the similar model was followed in Europe, and later, to a great extent, the same model has been followed in China. So as a consequence of that, almost 90% of the total carbon space available in the world, close to about 90% of the carbon space available in the world today, all of you are aware that we have to reach 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2050. Otherwise, the earth may survive, but we as human beings will not survive. And latest studies show that we are far behind in our target of 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, 90% of the carbon space has been available, and only very minimal carbon spaces required is available for the developing world. So, developing world is in a very different position from the developed world because they have already developed and advanced. But the industrialization process of most of the developing countries has just begun. And our process of urbanization has just begun. By 2050, we will be seeing 500 million people getting into the process of urbanization. That means the challenge for India is to create two Americas. Every 5 years, we'll be creating a new Chicago. So the challenge is that how does India urbanize, industrialize, and become the first country in the world by not following the model which the western part of the world has adopted. Now, the western part of the world has already used fossil fuel. They continue to use fossil fuel. And country like India has to be the first country in the world to industrialize and urbanize without using fossil fuel. And that is the first country in the world to industrialize through a process of decarbonization. So to my mind, the challenges are that we should do renewables. That is one component. That all electricity must become renewable, which would mean that you would require solar, which we have advanced very rapidly. We achieved our NDC target 9 years ahead of schedule. solar rooftop. We should expedite solar rooftop. Whatever policy changes are required needs to be done. But even if we do 100% of our renewables, of our electricity as renewable, electricity is only 20% of your energy consumption. So first thing we must understand is that electricity is only 20% of your energy consumption. The balance 80% of your energy consumption actually comes on what is known as hard to abate sectors. And hard to abate sectors is refinery, steel, cement, it's fertilizer, it's long distance transport. So 80% of your energy is hard to abate sectors. Unless and until you don't decarbonize 80% of your energy, it's not possible to do decarbonization. So you have to focus on renewable, 80% of your hard to abate sectors, that is all these sectors like steel, cement, refinery, etc. Now India imports worth almost 200 billion worth of fossil fuel. 200 billion worth of fossil fuel is our import, which we use in refinery, steel, cement, because there you can't use electricity, so you use either coal or you use gas, imported gas, in all these areas. Now, what the Prime Minister has said is that by 2047, when India becomes 100, we should, instead of importing, we should become an exporter of energy. We should be exporting energy. That means don't import fossil fuel, export clean energy. And clean energy means that we should have the strength to do renewables. We should crack water, use the process of electrolyzer, and produce green hydrogen. If you are able to produce green hydrogen, then you will be able to provide green hydrogen to all your refineries, steel, cement, and replace coal or replace imported gas. And that 80% of the energy can then be provided by green hydrogen. So the challenge for India is that today the cost of green hydrogen is $4.5 per kilogram. $4.5 per kilogram. It has to bring down the cost of green hydrogen to $1 per kilogram by 2030. And if it is able to bring down the cost of green hydrogen, and that the challenge is because there's no other country which is blessed with climatic conditions like India has. So India is climatically blessed. The only other country which has similar climatic condition is Saudi Arabia, which is full of fossil fuel. But no other country has the similar climatic conditions, so India should be able to produce green hydrogen. And in its liquid form, you can't export green hydrogen, but in its liquid form, ammonia, you can transport it to the rest of the world. So, the main disruption that is happening across the world today, whether you look at United States of America, which has introduced the IRA Act, in the name of Inflation Reduction Act, the United States of America is aiming to become a champion of green hydrogen, to produce green hydrogen. But in United States of America, the climatic conditions are not like India. It costs them $7.5 to produce green hydrogen. In India, it only costs $4.5 per ton. So they are subsidizing to an extent of 40%. 40%. We are not doing that much of subsidization, but you need size and scale to become a global champion. So the challenge is that how do you become a global champion in India? And that is the strategy which all large companies, whether you look at Reliance, whether you look at Adani, whether you look at Greenco, whether you look at Acme, whether you look at Renew, all of them are aiming to get into green hydrogen and make India the global champion of green hydrogen. So, the challenge for India is to become the lowest cost producer of renewables. Use renewable to crack water. That means you need an electrolyzer. You have to become the cheapest manufacturer of electrolyzer. Then you have to become the cheapest manufacturer of green hydrogen. Then you have to become, the opportunity for India is by 2047 become an exporter. That's your ambition. Become an exporter of clean energy to the world. Instead of importing 200 billion, become an exporter. You should be earning 200 billion by exporting energy. And that means that you should become the cheapest producer of renewable, cheapest producer of electrolyzer, cheapest producer of green hydrogen. And Indian manufacturers, that is Tata Motors, Mahindra and MG Motors, which is SAIC, they have only 1% share, 1% share of the global market. Now, disruption is taking place. You are moving from 200 parts in combustion vehicle to 20 parts. Whether you like it or not, this disruption is taking place at a rapid pace. Every manufacturer is at the same level, and that is why Tata's went in for electric vehicles first. Today they control 80% of the Indian market. So if Maruti doesn't go electric, Hyundai doesn't go electric, they will lose market share. Future consumers will buy only electric vehicles, as has happened in Europe, as is happening in America and USA. And therefore, everybody is shifting to EV platforms. Now, two-wheelers, we've rapidly pushed for electric. Three-wheelers, we are very advanced in electric now, very, very advanced in electric. And I think our objective should be that by 2030, 100% of our two-wheelers, 100% of our two-wheelers and three-wheelers must go electric. That should be our challenge. Because if you don't do that, you would have lost market share. You will not be able to export and become a global champion in two-wheelers and three-wheelers. So if you become a manufacturer of electric two-wheelers and three-wheelers, the lead which India has in combustion two-wheelers and three-wheelers, we will be able to take the lead in electric two-wheelers because the world will go electric. The challenge is that in mobility, you can do batteries in two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and you can store batteries and run two-wheelers, three-wheelers, four-wheelers, but in the long-distance transport, my view is that over a period of time, green hydrogen will be the right vehicle for long-term movement. So the transition that is taking place across the world is that you need renewable, you need to become low-cost producer, you need to become the cheapest producer of electrolyzer, of green hydrogen, you need to become a huge manufacturer of two-wheelers, three-wheelers, four-wheelers, and because the Indian consumer will demand it. And if the Indian consumer demands it, then the world is already demanding it. If you don't do it, you'll lose market share. But to be able to do all this, India will require substantial climate finance. Because if we have to meet our developmental and climate ambition, the scale of finance cannot be met just by public funds. We need to catalyze private finance. That is important. And we need to catalyze private finance to meet the scale of climate investments. Now, the scale of financing is enormous, and it cannot be met by either our own banks, which have high interest rates, or cannot be met from World Bank. because World Bank and IMF were all institutions made in the post-World War II period. They were made for another era in the post-Bretton Woods period. These are not institutions which support, which finance climate finance. And for the first time, during India's G20 presidency, we put pressure that these institutions must become climate financing institutions and institutions for sustainable development goals. So, today the World Bank mobilizes only 0.6 cents to a dollar from private capital, whereas it should be doing 5x of every dollar to support more funds. So it should be able to stimulate more of private sector funds. So it is crucial to engage with institutional and private investors, as there's no shortage of funds in the world. There is $300 trillion available with the private funding agencies. Almost $150 trillion is available with sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. They all want to fund for climate finance. But the challenge is the risks for developing countries are very different from the risks of the developed world. And that is why finance is available at 2% in US and Europe. It's available at 8% in India. It's available at 16% in Africa. It's available at 22% in sub-Saharan countries. So the acceleration of pace of change at 2% in United States and Europe will be much higher than 8% in India and 16% in Africa. The challenge is that India is growing at about 7.5%, United States is growing at 3.5%, the six of the fastest growing, 75% of the growth in the world is coming from emerging markets. According to IMF, in the next 2 decades, 80% of the growth will come from emerging markets. 6 of the fastest growing countries in the world are from Africa, and therefore, it's the emerging markets and developing countries which need finance to transform so that they do not repeat the mistakes which the western part of the world has made. And therefore, the compelling rationale for substantially expanding the application of blended finance is important. You need to change the risk-reward framework. You need to change the risk-reward framework so that the risks of emerging markets are covered and these projects are de-risked. Now, blended finance is actually combining concessional finance from donors or third parties along with multilateral development banks, their own normal financing, and commercial finance from other investors to develop private sector markets and mobilize private resources. The challenge for the world is, how do we raise private finance? So you need private finance at fund level, at project level, at company level. All blended financing from all sources is critical for meeting both India's and the emerging markets' climate ambition. So all that is discussed in COP, all these big meetings in COP and all are useless. They have no relevance. They are all meeting places unless and until we are not able to mobilize private finance for countries of developing countries. And therefore, the challenge is that how do we ensure that India is able to get climate financing at 2% and not 8% to be able to accelerate the pace of transformation. And this requires a prudent combination of private and public financing to enhance what I feel is the returns of high-risk climate projects And it's very important to push this, because from 2026 to 2030, India will require annual clean energy investments, to my mind, in the range of US dollar close to about 260 billion, to align with its development and climate ambitions. And this will then rise to about 355 billion over the 2031 to 2035 period. And this is necessary if we have to achieve our net zero target by 2070. And India would require cumulative investments worth over 10 trillion, which is almost thrice the size of India's current GDP if we have to push for net zero by 2070. Now, this is an ambitious target. There's no shortage of funds. Funds are not a challenge. There are 300 trillion available. India needs only 10 trillion. 300 trillion is sitting with sovereign wealth funds and private funds. India needs only 10 trillion. Now, today, if you look at green finance, we attract about US dollar 44 billion per annum. It's less than a fourth of what India actually needs. And domestic sources continue to account for the majority of climate finance. The domestic sources account for almost 80%. So only 20% of the money we are getting from outside. And out of this domestic sources, private finance actually accounts for about 59%. And more private investment needs to be unlocked and mobilized, because to reach the climate goals is not 44 billion, we need about 10 trillion. So India has actually deployed blended financing instruments in the past. It's not that we have not used them. The Water and Sanitation Pooled Fund in Tamil Nadu actually issued a pooled bond worth about 6.2 million to facilitate access to long-term domestic capital market earlier. We've seen that there has been we feel that there is a huge possibility of attracting private sector financing if we are able to structure projects well. And the growth of climate change related ventures in India necessitates a well-balanced mix of both equity and debt financing to effectively transition from early stage transition to advanced stages. And this will aid projects because we need to support startups in many of these areas, and this will aid us. You need various blended finance instruments such as grants, technical support, guarantees, concessional or subordinate debt, first loss provisions, risk mitigation guarantees, and junior equity. They are all commonly employed in emerging markets. Their widespread adoption in India should be considered, taking into account this huge possibility for climate projects. And mobilizing these investments in India and reducing dependence on traditional markets while hedging against economic downturns in other parts of the world is necessary. Now, India's G20 presidency has been instrumental in aiding the reform of multilateral development banks. And as I said, today multilateral development banks only mobilize US dollar 0.6 in private capital for each dollar they lend on their own account. I think in the short run, they should really aim at doubling this target. And World Bank has initiated efforts in this direction. ADB has become a climate bank now. And these are good measures. So India's pushed for this. And G20 has advised MDBs to shift their approach by focusing on three key aspects: making private capital mobilization a central element of their sustainable development strategy, supporting governments in reducing policy and regulatory risks to private investment, and aligning their financial product offering to private capital market gaps. We in India are ready to further mobilize private capital because we are pushing for climate action. We are pushing for transformation. We are pushing for green hydrogen. There's a green hydrogen mission. We are pushing for electric vehicle transformation. We are pushing for green hydrogen. We are pushing for renewable energy. We are a global champion in many of these areas. And we are witnessing a remarkable momentum, particularly in critical sectors such as infrastructure, clean energy, healthcare, education. Now, there are several examples. The Bloomberg Philanthropies and Goldman Sachs backed Climate Innovation and Development Fund recently financed the decarbonization of 100 of the 255 e-buses by deploying solar power plus battery energy storage systems as part of the 5.2 million blended financing instrument. We have witnessed India's cooperative banks providing credit enhancement and credit affordability, as seen in the case of blended finance facility in Rann of Kutch, where it facilitated access to mainstream debt finance for women salt farmers to transition away from energy inefficient diesel pumps. So that's a unique example. And the Indian government has taken several initiatives to address the impediments of the financial instrument. The US-India Clean Energy Finance, HUSE, is a great example whereby the multi-stakeholder partnership identified and supported nearly 50 nascent enterprises operating since 2015. And the grant investment of 5 million further mobilized 285 million in debt, generating 670 megawatt of renewable capacity and over 20,000 jobs in India. And India's leading role in the green bond market with over 10 billion in cumulative issuances, and all this coupled with RBI's membership, their own drive in NGFS will be very critical in stimulating domestic blended finance initiatives. So, climate change is all about reimagining traditional modes of financing. It is very necessary to mobilize private sector financing. It will not be possible through traditional banks. It will not be possible through traditional methods. You need to seek out additional opportunities for collaboration in the realm of blended finance. You need a range of instruments which I talked about. You need a range of instruments where you are able to push for blended financing instruments from all sources, which are very critical. And private financing will really be the key to India's growth story if India is to transition from fossil fuel to clean energy, if India is to become. The ambition should be that India must become the first country in the world to become a manufacturing nation, a new urbanization center, without going for fossil fuel. India has the opportunity. India is climatically blessed. That cannot happen without reducing risks. Risks cannot be reduced without getting private finance to flow in, because traditional sources of finance will not be able to fund it. And the only way out is to be able to get blended finance for both this huge movement for renewable green hydrogen and for becoming a global champion in electric mobility. And without becoming a champion in all these three areas, India will never be able to become, it will be very difficult for India to become a global champion. I've been a long-term believer that India must get into sunrise areas of growth. Without getting into sunrise areas of growth like green hydrogen, electric mobility, battery storage, it'll be very difficult to become a $10 trillion economy and to grow at high rates. India needs to grow at 9 to 10% per annum year after year for 3 decades. And that is only possible if we are able to get into sunrise areas and become a champion of green hydrogen. And that will not be possible without finance, and that finance means that you must be able to get blended finance. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure talking to all of you. Thank you so much.